The park was a sanctuary for Elijah. On most mornings, he'd settle into his usual bench beneath the sprawling oak tree, its shade providing a cool respite from the sun. He'd bring a well-worn book, a thermos of coffee, and a peaceful resolve that had taken years to cultivate. It was a small ritual. But for Elijah, it symbolized something bigger. The world could be chaotic and cruel, but there were pockets of tranquility to be claimed. The laughter of children, the rustle of leaves, the occasional bark of a dog, all of it felt like music to his ears. Today, however, the music carried a sour note. Elijah noticed them immediately, 3 teenagers lingering near the park entrance. One of them, a lanky boy with pale skin and a mop of unkempt hair, seemed to be the leader. He strutted ahead of his companions with a swagger that was too rehearsed to be natural. Elijah had seen his kind before. Anger disguised as confidence. Insecurity dressed up as bravado. The boy's voice carried over the din of the park. Loud and biting. "Look at this place." The boy, Jake, sneered. "Filled with freaks and losers." Elijah shifted in his seat but kept his focus on his book. Experience had taught him that some battles weren't worth fighting. But Jake had a way of sniffing out targets. And his sharp gaze landed on Elijah. For a moment, the boy hesitated, as if weighing the risk of provoking the older man. Then he smirked and sauntered over. "What's up, old man?" Jake's voice dripped with mockery. "Enjoying your little corner of the world?" Elijah looked up, meeting Jake's gaze with calm, steady eyes. "Just enjoying the day, son," he replied. His voice was warm, even inviting, but it carried a weight that made Jake pause. Jake wasn't expecting kindness. It threw him off balance. But only for a moment. "You got some nerve sitting here like you own the place," he said, his tone hardening. "People like you think you're so special." "Huh?" Elijah didn't flinch. He closed his book carefully, placing it beside him on the bench. "I don't think I'm special," he said evenly. "I'm just a man, same as anyone else." Jake's friend snickered from a distance, emboldening him. "Man, huh? Is that what you call yourself? Sitting here, pretending like you're better than everyone else?" Elijah saw the trap for what it was. Jake wanted a reaction, something to fuel his anger. But Elijah refused to give it to him. Instead, he leaned back, crossing his arms. "You seem upset, son," he said. "What's really bothering you?" That question hit a nerve. Jake's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. But he recovered quickly, his voice rising. "Don't act like you know me. You don't know a damn thing about me." "I don't," Elijah admitted, "but I can see you're hurting. And I know that hurt doesn't go away by tearing someone else down." Jake's face flushed with anger. "You don't get to lecture me," he shouted. The commotion drew the attention of other park goers. But no one dared to intervene. Some whispered among themselves. Others walked away, unwilling to get involved. Elijah sighed. He hated being a spectacle. But he knew this moment wasn't about him. It was about Jake, a boy caught in a storm of his own making. "I'm not lecturing you," Elijah said gently. "I'm just asking you to think about the path you're on." Jake stepped closer, his fists clenched. "You think you're better than me, don't you? Just because you're old and wise or whatever." Elijah met Jake's glare with an unshakable calm. "I think we all have choices," he said, "and the choices you're making right now, they lead to places you don't want to go." That was the breaking point. Jake shoved Elijah hard, nearly knocking him off the bench. Gasps rippled through the park as the bystanders realized the confrontation had turned physical. Elijah steadied himself, gripping the edge of the bench. His heart raced, but he refused to let fear or anger take hold. "Son," Elijah said quietly, "you're crossing a line you can't uncross." Jake laughed, though it sounded hollow. "What are you gonna do about it? Huh? Call the cops? Hit me back? I don't need to do any of that," Elijah replied. "The world has a way of catching up to people who make the wrong choices. You'll see that soon enough." Before Jake could respond, a firm voice cut through the tension. "What's going on here?" A police officer approached, his hand resting on his holster. His presence immediately shifted the energy in the park. Jake froze, his bravado crumbling under the weight of authority. Elijah sat back, relieved but wary. "He started it," Jake blurted, pointing at Elijah. "He was trying to provoke me." The officer glanced at Elijah, who remained seated, his hands in plain view. "Sir, is that true?" Elijah shook his head. "No, officer. I was just sitting here, minding my business." Before the officer could say more, a woman's voice rang out. "What's going on here? Why are you talking to my son?" Rebecca stormed onto the scene, her face a mask of fury. She marched up to the officer, her finger jabbing the air. "I want to know why you're harassing my boy." "Ma'am," the officer said, his tone measured, "your son was involved in an altercation. We're trying to sort it out." "An altercation?" Rebecca's eyes widened in outrage. "With this man? You're taking his word over my son's?" Elijah stood slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. "Ma'am, no one's accusing your son of anything. We're just trying to de-escalate the situation." But Rebecca wasn't interested in de-escalation. She turned on Elijah, her voice shrill. "You think you can just sit here and accuse my son? You don't know what he's been through." Elijah opened his mouth to respond, but the officer stepped between them. "Ma'am, I need you to calm down." Rebecca's fury only intensified. "Calm down? You're defending this man while my son is being treated like a criminal." "Your son shoved him," the officer said firmly, "and now you're interfering with an investigation. If you don't step back, I'll have to take you in." Rebecca's face twisted with disbelief. "You wouldn't dare." But the officer didn't flinch. Moments later, Rebecca was in handcuffs, her protests echoing through the park. Jake watched in stunned silence as his mother was led away. The boy's bravado had vanished, replaced by a look of sheer terror. Elijah watched the scene unfold, his heart heavy. He didn't feel victorious, only tired. As Jake was escorted toward the police car, their eyes met briefly. In that fleeting moment, Elijah saw something in the boy's gaze, not anger, but fear. Fear of the consequences, fear of himself. Elijah sighed and sat back down on his bench. The world kept spinning, the park still filled with laughter and birdsong. But for Elijah, the day had shifted. He opened his book again, though his thoughts lingered on the boy and the path he had chosen. He could only hope that Jake would find his way back. Elijah watched as the police car pulled away. Jake and his mother, Rebecca, seated in the back. The park slowly returned to its usual rhythm, but a strange unease lingered in the air, like the echoes of a storm that had only just begun to rumble. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment press against his chest. Elijah had been through enough in his life to recognize that this was far from over. Jake sat in the back of the police car, his knuckles white as he gripped the seat in front of him. His mother's voice was a torrent of outrage, railing against the injustice of their arrest. "This is absurd. I'm calling my lawyer as soon as we get to the station." Rebecca's voice was sharp and commanding, but Jake wasn't listening. His mind raced, replaying the confrontation with Elijah. The man's calm face, the steadiness in his voice, it all felt like a mirror reflecting back everything Jake hated about himself. And then there was the crowd, the whispers, the judgment in their eyes. He had felt powerful in the moment, shoving Elijah, but that power had crumbled like a house of cards as soon as the officer arrived. Now he was just scared, a feeling he wasn't used to confronting. "You're not saying a word to them. Jake, do you hear me?" Rebecca's voice snapped him out of his spiral. "They're going to twist this into something it's not. We'll fight this." Jake nodded mechanically, but the knot in his stomach tightened. The anger that had fueled him earlier felt distant now, replaced by something more unsettling, doubt. Back at the park, Elijah sat still, staring at the book in his lap without reading a word. He had faced many battles in his life, on the streets, in the workplace, even within his own family, but this one left a bitter taste. It wasn't the physical shove or the slurs that hurt the most. It was the knowledge that boys like Jake didn't become hateful overnight. Somewhere along the way, they were taught to fear and despise. "Are you okay?" A soft voice interrupted his thoughts. Elijah looked up to see a young woman standing nearby. She looked nervous, clutching a leash as her small dog tugged impatiently at her side. "I'm fine," Elijah said, offering a small smile. "Thank you for asking. I saw what happened," she said hesitantly. "That was intense. You handled it really well." Elijah nodded, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes, handling it well is the only option." The woman hesitated, then gave a small nod and walked away, leaving Elijah alone with his thoughts. He picked up his book again, forcing himself to focus, but as the sun dipped lower in the sky, he couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter would ripple far beyond the park. At the police station, Jake and Rebecca were separated for questioning. Jake sat in a small, stark room, his knee bouncing nervously as he waited. The walls seemed to close in on him. Their cold, gray surface amplifying the silence. He didn't know how long he'd been there when the door finally opened. A middle-aged officer with a weathered face stepped inside. He had a calm demeanor, but his sharp eyes took in every detail of Jake's posture. His fidgeting hands, the nervous dart of his eyes. "Jake, right?" the officer said. Sitting across from him, Jake nodded, his throat dry. "I'm Officer Daniels. I just want to have a conversation. All right? No need to be nervous." "I'm not nervous," Jake said quickly, though his voice betrayed him. Daniels raised an eyebrow but didn't press the point. "Tell me what happened at the park." Jake hesitated. The instinct to defend himself rose up, fueled by his mother's constant drilling that he was never to admit fault. But something about the officer's steady gaze made it hard to lie outright. "That guy, Elijah," Jake began. The name felt strange on his tongue. "He was provoking me." "Provoking you how?" Jake faltered. He was sitting there, acting like he was better than me." Daniels leaned back, crossing his arms. "Sitting and reading a book made you feel like he thought he was better than you?" Jake flushed. "You don't get it. He was judging me." Daniels didn't respond immediately. He let the silence stretch, forcing Jake to sit with his words. Finally, the officer said, "Sounds to me like you were judging him." Jake opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. For a moment, all he could hear was Elijah's voice in his head. "The choices you're making right now, they lead to places you don't want to go." Meanwhile, Rebecca sat in another room, her arms crossed and her jaw set. She was seething, ready to unleash on anyone who dared to challenge her version of events. When an officer finally entered, she launched into a tirade. "I want to speak to your supervisor," she demanded. "This is an outrageous abuse of power. My son did nothing wrong." The officer, a composed young woman named Martinez, didn't rise to Rebecca's bait. "Ma'am, your son was seen physically assaulting another individual, and you were arrested for interfering with an officer. These are serious charges." Rebecca scoffed. "Don't lecture me. That man provoked my son. He was looking for trouble." Martinez remained calm. "From what I understand, the man was sitting on a bench, reading a book." Rebecca's face turned red, but her voice stayed sharp. "He's not some innocent victim. People like him." "People like him?" Martinez interrupted, her tone firm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" "Ma'am?" Rebecca faltered, her words catching in her throat. For a brief moment, the mask of righteous indignation slipped, revealing the raw prejudice beneath. She quickly recovered, but Martinez had already seen enough. As the hours ticked by, the stark reality of the situation began to sink in for both Jake and Rebecca. But while Rebecca doubled down on her defiance, Jake found himself replaying Elijah's words over and over in his mind. The man had been calm, even kind, despite everything Jake had thrown at him. And now, sitting in the harsh fluorescent light of the police station, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he had crossed a line he didn't fully understand. When the door to his holding room opened again, Jake looked up to see Officer Daniels holding a file. "We're releasing you tonight," Daniels said, "but this isn't over. There'll be a court date, and you're going to have to face the consequences of your actions." Jake swallowed hard. "What's going to happen to my mom?" Daniels sighed. "That depends on her, but right now, I'm more concerned about you. You got a choice to make. Jake, keep going down this path, or figure out a better way." Jake didn't respond, but as he followed the officer out of the room, his mind churned with questions he wasn't ready to answer. Back at the park, the sun had set, and Elijah finally rose from his bench. As he walked home, the weight of the day pressed heavily on him. He didn't know what would happen to Jake or Rebecca, but he prayed that someone, would reach them. Because deep down, Elijah still believed in the possibility of change, even for someone like Jake, even for someone like Rebecca. But he also knew that change didn't come easily. It required facing hard truths, something most people spent their whole lives avoiding. As he turned onto his street, Elijah allowed himself a small moment of hope. Perhaps, in some unexpected way, today's events could plant the seed of something better. But for now, he could only wait and see what the days ahead would bring. The air inside the courtroom was thick with tension. Jake sat stiffly at the defendant's table, his mother's shadow hovering behind him as though her sheer presence could shield him from the weight of his actions. Rebecca's sharp gaze darted between the judge, the prosecutor, and the audience, as if daring anyone to challenge her version of the truth. Jake, on the other hand, couldn't bring himself to meet anyone's eyes. The judge, a stern woman in her 60s with gray streaks in her neatly tied hair, studied the file before her. Jake Monroe, she began, her voice even but commanding. Charged with assault and disturbing the peace. How does the defendant plead? Rebecca shot up from her seat. Your Honor, if I may. You may not. Mrs. Monroe, sit down. Rebecca's face turned red, but she reluctantly sank back into her seat, muttering under her breath. Jake glanced at her, a flicker of embarrassment crossing his face, but quickly looked away. We plead not guilty, Jake's court-appointed lawyer said, his voice firm but resigned. Jake knew the lawyer had little faith in his case. How could he? When so many witnesses had seen what happened. The judge adjusted her glasses. Very well. This court is prepared to offer a plea agreement. If the defendant pleads guilty, he will avoid jail time and instead serve 200 hours of community service and attend mandatory anger management counseling. If he chooses to plead not guilty, we will proceed to trial. Rebecca leaned over and whispered fiercely in Jake's ear. Don't take it. This is ridiculous. We'll fight it. Jake hesitated, his stomach churning. He glanced at Elijah, who was sitting in the audience. The older man's expression was unreadable, calm, composed, but watchful. For a moment, Jake felt a surge of defiance. Why should he admit guilt? Why should he? Then he remembered the shove. The way Elijah had stumbled but hadn't fought back. The way the man had looked at him, not with anger, but with something worse. Disappointment. Jake swallowed hard. I'll take the deal, he said quietly. Rebecca's mouth fell open. Jake, I said I'll take the deal. Jake repeated, louder this time. His voice trembled, but there was a flicker of resolve in his eyes. The judge nodded. Good choice. Sentencing is as follows. 200 hours of community service, to be served at community centers and shelters as assigned by the court, and enrollment in a court-approved anger management program. Additionally, you will write a formal apology to the victim. Failure to comply with these terms will result in immediate incarceration. Do you understand? Yes, Your Honor, Jake murmured. The gavel fell, and it was over, at least officially. But for Jake, the real trial was just beginning. Elijah watched Jake and Rebecca leave the courtroom. He had spoken briefly with the prosecutor beforehand, ensuring his input was heard. He didn't want the boy's life ruined by a single mistake. But as he watched Rebecca's stiff posture and Jake's slumped shoulders, he couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead would be far more difficult than either of them realized. Later that day, Elijah returned to the park. He needed the space to think, to reflect. The familiar sound of children's laughter and the rustle of leaves calmed him. But his thoughts were heavy. He didn't regret his decision not to press for a harsher sentence. But he couldn't help wondering if Jake would truly change, or if this was just a temporary reprieve. As he sat on the bench, a memory surfaced. Unbidden, he was young again, barely out of his teens, standing in the same courtroom he had just left. The circumstances had been different, but the feeling was the same, the weight of judgment, the fear of what came next. Elijah had been lucky. A mentor had taken him under their wing, showing him the value of second chances. Now, as he looked out at the park, he wondered if he could do the same for Jake. Jake's first day of community service was at a local shelter. The building was small and unassuming, its peeling paint a testament to years of wear and tear. Inside, the air smelled faintly of disinfectant and old furniture. Jake was handed a mop and told to clean the dining area. It was tedious work, and Jake hated every second of it. His resentment simmered beneath the surface, flaring every time someone looked at him for too long or asked him to move faster. But as the hours passed, something began to shift. He noticed the people around him, not the staff, but the shelter's guests. They were families, mostly, with children who clung to their parents' hands. Their faces were weary, but there was a kind of quiet determination in their eyes that Jake couldn't ignore. One little boy, no older than 6, caught Jake's attention. The child was sitting at a table, carefully coloring in a tattered coloring book. His mother sat nearby, her face lined with worry. Jake paused, the mop in his hand forgotten, and watched as the boy proudly showed his mother his drawing. For a brief moment, they both smiled. It hit Jake like a punch to the gut. That could have been him once. Years ago, before his father left, before his mother's anger became his whole world. He turned back to his work. But the image of the boy and his mother stayed with him. In the weeks that followed, Jake's counseling sessions became another battleground. At first, he resisted. He deflected questions, rolled his eyes at the exercises, and avoided any real introspection. But his counselor, a patient man named Dr. Lewis, had seen it all before. "Jake," Dr. Lewis said during one session, "why do you think you got so angry at Elijah?" Jake shrugged. "I don't know. He was just sitting there." "Do you think it was really about him?" Jake didn't answer. Dr. Lewis leaned forward. "Sometimes, when we're angry, it's not really about the person in front of us. It's about something deeper, something we don't want to face." "What do you think you were avoiding?" The question lingered, echoing in Jake's mind long after the session ended. Over time, he began to confront truths he had buried for years: his father's abandonment, his mother's constant bitterness, his own fear of being weak or powerless. It wasn't easy, and there were days when he wanted to quit. But something inside him, something small but stubborn, kept him going. Rebecca, meanwhile, refused to accept what had happened. She filed complaints, called lawyers, and ranted to anyone who would listen. But her efforts yielded little, and her relationship with Jake grew increasingly strained. He stopped confiding in her, stopped seeking her approval. For Rebecca, it felt like a betrayal. For Jake, it felt like freedom. One day, after finishing his community service shift, Jake found himself walking to the park. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was something deeper. He spotted Elijah on his usual bench, a book in his lap. Jake hesitated, his heart pounding. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, he approached. "Hey," he said awkwardly. Elijah looked up, his expression unreadable. "Hello, Jake." Jake scratched the back of his neck. "I wanted to say sorry for everything." Elijah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "I'm trying to, be better. It's not easy." "It never is," Elijah said. "But the fact that you're trying, that matters." Jake sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For the first time in weeks, he felt a glimmer of something he hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. The weight of the courtroom's decision lingered heavily on Jake as he walked out of the courthouse with his mother. Rebecca's heels clicked sharply against the tiled floor, her fury palpable with each step. She muttered angrily under her breath, but Jake barely heard her. His mind was elsewhere, swirling with shame, confusion, and something he wasn't quite ready to call regret. When they reached the car, Rebecca slammed the door and turned to him. "What were you thinking, Jake? Taking that deal? Admitting guilt? Do you realize what this does to us?" Jake stared out of the window, his voice low. "Mom, it's not about us. I messed up." Rebecca's hand tightened on the steering wheel. "Messed up? You didn't do anything wrong. That man provoked you. And now they've turned this whole thing into some morality play at our expense." Jake felt his chest tighten, but he didn't respond. Arguing with his mother was like trying to outrun a storm. It only made things worse. Instead, he let the silence stretch, her angry words fading into the background as the car sped toward home. The next morning, Jake reported to his first day of community service at a local shelter. The building was unremarkable, with peeling paint and a faded sign that read Hope Haven Community Center. Inside, the hum of activity was constant. Volunteers moved quickly between tasks, while families and individuals waited patiently for meals, supplies, or a kind word. Jake's supervisor, a middle-aged woman named Clara, didn't waste time on pleasantries. "You're here to work, not to chat," she said, handing him a mop. "The dining area needs cleaning before lunch service starts. Get to it." Jake muttered a quick, "Yes, ma'am," and got to work, his resentment simmering beneath the surface. The hours dragged as he mopped the floors, wiped down tables, and hauled trash bags to the dumpster. No one treated him with hostility, but he felt the weight of their eyes on him, watchful, judgmental. He hated it. At one point, a little boy ran past him, laughing as he chased a ball that had escaped from the play area. Jake couldn't help but glance at him, his movements slowing. The boy's carefree laughter tugged at something deep inside him, something he hadn't felt in a long time. "Focus, Jake," Clara called from across the room. He snapped out of it and resumed mopping, but the boy's laughter stayed with him. The counseling sessions were even harder. Jake sat in a small, sparsely decorated room with Dr. Lewis. a calm and patient man who seemed immune to Jake's deflections. During their first session, Jake crossed his arms and leaned back in his chair, his defenses firmly in place. "I don't see the point of this," Jake said. "I'm here because the court said I had to be." Dr. Lewis nodded. "That's a fair start. But tell me, Jake, do you think there's anything you can learn here?" Jake scoffed. "What? How to stop getting caught?" Dr. Lewis didn't rise to the bait. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his gaze steady. "How to understand yourself better. How to figure out why you felt the way you did that day at the park." "I don't need to figure anything out," Jake snapped. "That guy, he was sitting there like he owned the place. Like he thought he was better than me." "Did he say that? That he thought he was better than you?" Jake opened his mouth to respond, but the words caught in his throat. He remembered Elijah's calm voice, the way he had stayed seated, unshaken. No, the man hadn't said anything like that. But still, Jake had felt it, hadn't he? "I don't know," Jake mumbled. Dr. Lewis nodded again. "That's a start. We'll figure it out together." At home, Rebecca's frustration boiled over. She paced the living room, her voice rising as she railed against the court system, the police, and even Elijah. Jake tried to tune her out, retreating to his room whenever he could. But her anger seeped through the walls, a constant reminder of the world she had built for them, a world of blame, deflection, and bitterness. One evening, she cornered him in the kitchen. "Why aren't you fighting back?" she demanded. "Why are you letting them treat you like a criminal?" Jake's hands tightened around the glass of water he was holding. "Maybe because I acted like one." Rebecca's eyes flashed with anger. "Don't you dare talk to me like that. I'm your mother. Everything I've done for you." Jake met her gaze for the first time in weeks. "Maybe that's the problem," he said quietly, then walked away. As the weeks passed, something began to shift inside Jake. The long hours at the shelter and the probing questions from Dr. Lewis were chipping away at the walls he had built around himself. He started to notice things he hadn't before, the resilience of the people he served at the shelter, the small acts of kindness that made their burdens a little lighter. One day, as he was cleaning tables, he noticed a young woman struggling to carry trays of food to a table where her two small children waited. Without thinking, Jake stepped forward. "Let me help you." The woman hesitated, then nodded. "Thank you." As Jake set the trays down, one of the children, a little girl no older than 5, looked up at him with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a worker here?" she asked. Jake froze, unsure how to answer. Finally, he said, "I'm just helping out." The girl smiled. "That's nice." Her simple words stayed with him long after the shift ended. One evening, Jake found himself walking through the park. It wasn't planned, his feet had simply carried him there. He spotted Elijah sitting on his usual bench, a book in his hands. For a moment, Jake hesitated, his heart pounding. Then, summoning all the courage he could muster, he approached. "Hi," he said awkwardly. Elijah looked up, his face calm but watchful. "Hello, Jake." Jake shifted uncomfortably, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I did, for everything I said." Elijah studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Jake exhaled, the tension in his chest easing slightly. "I'm trying to, be better. It's hard." "It is," Elijah agreed, "but hard doesn't mean impossible." Jake sat down on the bench, leaving a respectful distance between them. For the first time in a long while, he felt a flicker of something he couldn't quite name. Hope, maybe, or the faintest sense of peace. Whatever it was, he wasn't ready to let it go. Elijah closed his book and looked at Jake. "The fact that you're here," he said, "it means you're already on the right path. Keep going." Jake nodded, a small but genuine smile forming on his lips. For the first time, he believed he could. The courtroom had been a whirlwind, but the real storm started once Jake and Rebecca left its doors. Jake could still feel the weight of the judge's words settling on his shoulders as they walked to the car. His mother's fury simmered beside him, her clipped steps and tight grip on her purse radiating indignation. "I can't believe this," Rebecca muttered, more to herself than to Jake. "They've humiliated us, made you out to be some kind of criminal. And you," she turned sharply, her gaze piercing. "Why did you take the deal? Why didn't you stand your ground?" Jake kept his eyes on the pavement, his jaw tight. "Mom, it's not that simple." "Not that simple?" Her voice rose, and Jake flinched. "They've branded you with this nonsense. And you're just rolling over for them? Jake stopped walking, his hands clenched into fists. I messed up, alright? I shoved him. I got angry. It's my fault. Rebecca's mouth opened, a retort on the tip of her tongue. But something in Jake's tone stopped her. For a brief moment, she seemed taken aback, as if she hadn't expected him to admit it. But the moment passed quickly. And she shook her head, dismissing his words. You don't get it, she said. None of this is fair. Jake said nothing. What was the point? Fairness wasn't the issue anymore. He knew that now. The first day of community service hit harder than Jake expected. He'd imagined himself picking up trash on the side of the road or stacking boxes in some back room. Instead, he was thrust into the bustling world of the Hope Haven Community Center, where the reality of other people's struggles stared him in the face. Welcome to Hope Haven, Clara, the supervisor, said as she handed him a mop and a bucket. This isn't a punishment. It's an opportunity to do something good. Don't waste it. Her words felt patronizing at first. But as the hours passed, Jake began to see the truth in them. The people who came through the center weren't just faces in a crowd, they were parents, children, and individuals trying to piece their lives together. Jake mopped floors, wiped down tables, and served meals, his resentment slowly replaced by something he couldn't quite name. One interaction, in particular, stuck with him. A woman with tired eyes and two small children approached the food counter. The older child, a boy around Jake's age when his father left, clung to her leg while the younger one babbled incoherently. Thank you, the woman said softly as Jake handed her a tray. Her voice was strained but sincere. Jake nodded, unsure how to respond. As she walked away, he caught sight of the older child glancing back at him. Their eyes met for a split second, and Jake felt a pang of something he hadn't felt in years. Guilt mixed with an odd sense of responsibility. Counseling was another hurdle Jake hadn't expected to hit so hard. Dr. Lewis, his court-appointed therapist, was calm and unrelenting in his approach. Every session began the same way, with silence. Jake would sit across from him, arms crossed, his gaze fixed somewhere else. Jake, Dr. Lewis said one day, breaking the quiet, why do you think you got so angry at the park? Jake shrugged. I don't know. He was just there. Just sitting there? Dr. Lewis pressed. Jake shifted uncomfortably. Yeah, acting like, I don't know, like he thought he was better than me. Did he say anything like that? Jake hesitated. The memory of Elijah's calm voice and steady gaze surfaced. Unbidden. No, but he looked like it. Dr. Lewis leaned forward slightly. What does looking like it mean to you? Jake? Was it the way he sat? The way he didn't react to you? Jake's jaw tightened. I don't know. Dr. Lewis didn't push further. But his words lingered long after the session ended. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the anger he'd felt that day wasn't about Elijah at all. It was something deeper, something he wasn't ready to face. At home, Rebecca's frustration boiled over. She called lawyers, filed complaints, and even confronted the shelter staff on one occasion, accusing them of treating Jake unfairly. Jake stayed out of her way as much as possible, retreating to his room whenever her anger flared. One evening, she cornered him in the kitchen. Why aren't you fighting this? She demanded. Why are you letting them treat you like a criminal? Jake set down the plate he was washing and turned to face her. Because I acted like one. Rebecca froze, her mouth opening and closing as if she couldn't process his words. Don't you dare. It's true, Jake interrupted, his voice steady. I was angry, and I took it out on someone who didn't deserve it. I made a mistake. Rebecca's face twisted with disbelief. You're my son. You don't just roll over for people like that. People like what, Mom? Jake asked, his voice rising for the first time. Like Elijah? You don't even know him. Rebecca recoiled as if he'd slapped her. He's nothing, she hissed, and I won't let you ruin your life over someone like him. Jake stared at her, his chest heaving. Maybe it's not about him. Maybe it's about me not turning into. He stopped himself, the words hanging in the air. Rebecca's eyes narrowed. Not turning into what? Jake shook his head, grabbing his jacket and heading for the door. Forget it. Jake found himself at the park later that night. The air was cool, and the world felt quieter than it had in weeks. He sat on a bench, staring at the empty pathways. His mind wandered back to Elijah, to the way the man had handled himself that day. Calm, steady, unshaken. Could Jake ever be like that? He didn't have an answer. The following weeks brought more change. At the shelter, Jake began to notice the resilience of the people he served. A single father, struggling to care for his kids. An elderly woman who smiled despite the hardship etched into her face. And then there was Clara, who treated every person who walked through the doors with the same unwavering respect. One afternoon, Jake found himself talking to a little boy who had wandered away from his mother. The boy was clutching a battered toy truck, his wide eyes filled with curiosity. "Hi," the boy said. "Are you a worker here?" Jake hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah, I guess I am." The boy smiled. "That's cool. My mom says people here help." Jake's chest tightened. "Yeah, we try." The boy's mother appeared moments later, thanking Jake profusely as she led her son away. But the boy's words stayed with Jake, echoing in his mind. A few days later, Jake returned to the park. This time, he wasn't wandering aimlessly. He spotted Elijah sitting on the same bench, a book in his lap. For a moment, Jake froze, uncertainty gripping him. Then, summoning every ounce of courage, he approached. "Hi," Jake said awkwardly. Elijah looked up, his expression calm but curious. "Hello, Jake." Jake shifted his weight from one foot to the other. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For what I did, for everything I said." Elijah studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Thank you." Jake sat down, leaving a respectful distance between them. The silence was heavy but not uncomfortable. "I'm trying to change," Jake said quietly. "But it's hard." Elijah turned to him, his gaze steady. "The hardest things are often the most worthwhile." Jake nodded, his chest feeling a little lighter. For the first time in a long while, he believed those words might be true. The days that followed Jake's apology were a blur of routine and reflection. Every shift at the community center, every counseling session, and every quiet moment at the park began to feel like pieces of a puzzle slowly falling into place. But while Jake was learning to confront his flaws and take responsibility, his journey was far from over. Change, he realized, was not a destination, it was a continuous process, filled with setbacks and small victories. At the community center, Clara had begun to notice Jake's subtle transformation. He no longer dragged his feet or avoided eye contact with the other volunteers. Instead, he worked diligently, sometimes even going beyond what was asked of him. One afternoon, as Jake was helping to sort donations in the back room, Clara approached him. "You've been doing good work here," she said, leaning against the doorway. Jake looked up, surprised. "Thanks," he said awkwardly. Compliments still felt foreign to him. Clara crossed her arms, her gaze thoughtful. "You know, when you first came here, I wasn't sure you'd stick it out. Most people don't, but you're proving me wrong." Jake shrugged, but her words sparked a small flicker of pride. I don't want to be that person anymore." Clara nodded. "Well, whatever your reasons, keep going. You've got potential. Jake, don't waste it." Her words stayed with him long after she walked away. For the first time in years, someone outside his family saw something in him, something worth nurturing. Counseling, however, remained a challenge. Dr. Lewis was patient but persistent, pushing Jake to confront the deeper roots of his anger. One session, in particular, stood out. "Jake," Dr. Lewis began, "I want to talk about your relationship with your mom." Jake tensed. He hated these sessions, the way they pried into parts of his life he'd rather leave buried. "What about it?" Dr. Lewis leaned back, his expression calm. "You've mentioned that she's protective, that she's always tried to defend you, even when you didn't ask her to. Do you think that's helped or hurt you?" Jake frowned, his jaw tightening. "She's my mom. She cares about me. I'm sure she does," Dr. Lewis said gently. "But sometimes, caring too much can mean shielding someone from consequences they need to face. Do you think that's happened with you?" The words stung because Jake knew there was truth in them. Rebecca's relentless defense of him, her refusal to acknowledge his mistakes, had created a safety net that often felt more like a cage. But saying that out loud felt like betrayal. "I don't know," Jake muttered. "Maybe." Dr. Lewis nodded, not pushing further. "It's something to think about. Change often starts with understanding the dynamics that shaped us. Once you see them clearly, you can decide what you want to keep and what you want to leave behind." Meanwhile, Rebecca's own struggles were intensifying. The complaints she filed were dismissed. The lawyers she contacted offered little hope. And her social circle began to shrink as her relentless outrage alienated those around her. For the first time in her life, Rebecca felt truly isolated, but rather than reflecting on her actions, she doubled down on her bitterness. One evening, Jake came home to find Rebecca sitting at the kitchen table, a glass of wine in her hand. Her face was drawn, her usual fire dimmed. "Hey," Jake said cautiously, setting his bag down. Rebecca glanced at him, her eyes narrowing. "Out late again? What, spending time with your new best friends at that shelter?" Jake sighed, bracing himself. "Mom, I'm just doing what I need to do. You know that." Rebecca took a sip of her wine, her gaze distant. "I don't know who you are anymore. Jake, you're not the son I raised." The words hit harder than Jake expected. "Maybe that's a good thing," he said quietly. Rebecca's head snapped up, her eyes blazing. "Excuse me?" Jake hesitated, but he knew it was time to say what had been building inside him. "Mom, you've always fought my battles for me. But maybe that's part of why I got into this mess. I need to figure things out for myself now." Rebecca stared at him, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Jake thought she might say something. But instead, she stood and walked out of the room, her glass of wine forgotten on the table. As Jake's hours at the community center came to an end, he began to realize how much the experience had changed him. He'd started to build connections, not just with the people he served, but with the volunteers and staff who worked alongside him. Clara had become something of a mentor, her no-nonsense approach tempered by a genuine belief in his potential. On his last day, the staff threw a small send-off for him. Nothing extravagant, just a cake and a few kind words. But it meant more to Jake than he could express. "You've done good work here," Clara said as she handed him a certificate of completion. "Don't stop now." Jake nodded, his throat tight. "I won't, thank you, for everything." As he walked out of the center that day, he felt a strange mix of sadness and hope. The work had been hard, but it had given him purpose. Now, it was up to him to carry that forward. A few weeks later, Jake returned to the park. He hadn't planned it, but something had drawn him back to the place where everything had started. As he walked along the familiar paths, he spotted Elijah sitting on his usual bench, a book in his hands. "Mind if I join you?" Jake asked, his voice hesitant. Elijah looked up and smiled. "Not at all." Jake sat down, the weight of the past months settling over him. For a while, they sat in comfortable silence, the sounds of the park filling the air. "I finished my community service," Jake said finally. "And the counseling?" Elijah nodded. "Good. How do you feel?" "Different," Jake admitted. "Better, I think. But it's hard. Every day. It's hard." Elijah closed his book, his expression thoughtful. "The hard days are the ones that matter most. They're the ones that shape who you become." Jake nodded, his chest tightening. "I don't want to be like my mom," he said quietly. "I love her, but I don't want to live like that. Always angry, always blaming other people." Elijah studied him for a moment, then placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "You've already taken the first step, Jake. Recognizing what you don't want is just as important as knowing what you do. Keep moving forward. The path won't always be clear, but if you keep walking, you'll find your way." Jake looked at Elijah, his gratitude clear. "Thanks for everything." Elijah smiled. "You don't owe me thanks, Jake. Just promise me one thing." "What's that?" "Be kind to yourself and to others, even when it's hard." Jake nodded, the weight on his chest lifting slightly. "I will." As they sat together, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in a warm, golden light. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt a sense of peace, not because his journey was over, but because he finally believed it was worth continuing. And as he looked out at the world around him, he couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope, for himself and for the future. The crisp morning air greeted Jake as he stepped out of the house. He had barely spoken to his mother in days, their exchanges reduced to stilted nods and quiet avoidance. Rebecca's silence wasn't out of forgiveness or understanding, it was a weapon. A way of punishing Jake for stepping outside the narrative she had carefully constructed for their lives. But Jake no longer carried the weight of her disapproval like he once had. Each day was an exercise in redefining himself, and he was determined to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it was. At Dr. Lewis' office, Jake sat across from the counselor, his posture less defensive than it had been months ago. The walls of the small room were lined with books, their spines creased from years of use. Jake's gaze drifted over the titles, books on human behavior, resilience, and forgiveness, before settling on Dr. Lewis. "So, How have things been at home? Dr. Lewis asked, his voice calm and steady. Jake hesitated. It's quiet, he admitted. My mom and I aren't really talking. Dr. Lewis nodded. And how do you feel about that? Jake sighed, leaning back in his chair. I don't know. Part of me feels guilty. Like I should be trying harder to fix things. But another part of me feels relieved. Like I don't have to keep pretending everything's fine. That's a big realization, Dr. Lewis said. It's okay to feel conflicted. Relationships, especially with family, are complicated. The important thing is to figure out what you want that relationship to look like, and what boundaries you need to set to protect your growth. Jake frowned. It just feels selfish, you know? Like, she's my mom, I shouldn't be pulling away. It's not selfish to take care of yourself. Jake, Dr. Lewis said gently, sometimes, creating distance is the healthiest choice you can make. It doesn't mean you don't love her, it just means you're prioritizing your well-being. Jake didn't respond immediately, but Dr. Lewis' words stayed with him long after the session ended. A few days later, Jake found himself volunteering at a local food drive. It wasn't part of his court-mandated community service. Those hours were long completed, but Jake had felt a strange pull to continue giving back. Clara had recommended the food drive, and Jake was grateful for the suggestion. The atmosphere at the food drive was bustling but welcoming. Volunteers worked side by side, loading boxes of canned goods into cars and greeting families with warm smiles. Jake was assigned to the distribution line, handing out bags of fresh produce. As the day wore on, Jake noticed a man in the crowd who looked eerily familiar. It wasn't until the man approached the line that Jake realized it was Elijah. The older man carried himself with the same quiet dignity Jake had come to associate with him. But there was a subtle weariness in his eyes. Elijah? Jake said, surprised. Elijah looked up, his brows furrowing briefly before recognition dawned. Jake, he said, a small smile tugging at his lips. What are you doing here? Volunteering, Jake said, feeling a twinge of pride. What about you? Elijah held up a slip of paper. Picking up supplies for the community center. They're running low on fresh produce. Jake quickly grabbed a bag of fruits and vegetables, placing it in Elijah's hands. Here you go. Elijah studied him for a moment, his expression thoughtful. You've changed, he said simply. Jake scratched the back of his neck, feeling both embarrassed and grateful. I'm trying. That's all anyone can do. Elijah said. Keep trying. At home, the tension between Jake and Rebecca finally reached its breaking point. It started with a small comment, Rebecca complaining about the court system yet again, but it quickly spiraled into a heated argument. You're wasting your time with all this volunteering. Rebecca snapped. Do you think those people care about you? They'll take what they can get and leave you with nothing. Jake's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to stay calm. It's not about what I get, Mom. It's about helping people. Rebecca scoffed. Helping people? And what about helping yourself? You think this makes up for what you did? For how they've treated us? Jake took a deep breath, his voice steady. No, Mom, it's not about making up for anything. It's about being better, about not living with all this anger. Rebecca froze, her eyes narrowing. Anger? Is that what you think this is? Yes, Jake said firmly. You're angry all the time. Mom, at me, at the world, at anyone who doesn't fit into your idea of how things should be. And I'm tired of it. I don't want to live like that anymore. Rebecca's face twisted with a mix of hurt and fury. I've fought for you, Jake. I've done everything to protect you. I know, Jake said quietly, but maybe I don't need protecting anymore. The words hung in the air, heavy and unyielding. Rebecca turned away, her shoulders stiff, and Jake realized that this wasn't a fight he could win, not because he was wrong, but because Rebecca wasn't ready to hear the truth. The final piece of Jake's journey came on a quiet afternoon at the park. He had returned to the same bench where he had first met Elijah, hoping to find some clarity. The autumn leaves crunched underfoot as Jake approached, his hands tucked into his jacket pockets. Elijah was there, as always, a book resting on his lap. When he saw Jake, he smiled. Back again? Jake nodded, sitting down beside him. For a while, they sat in silence, the sounds of the park filling the space between them. I had a fight with my mom, Jake admitted finally. I told her I didn't want to live the way she does. Always angry, always blaming everyone else. Elijah nodded slowly. That's a hard thing to say, but it sounds like something you needed to say. Jake glanced at him. Do you think she'll ever change? Elijah sighed, his gaze distant. Change is a choice, Jake. Some people are ready for it, and some aren't. All you can do is focus on your own path. Jake nodded, his chest tightening. I want to be better, he said quietly. Not just for me, but so I don't end up like her. Elijah placed a hand on Jake's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. You've already started, and no matter how hard it gets, keep going. The world needs people who are willing to change, who are willing to grow. Jake swallowed hard, his eyes stinging. Thanks, Elijah, for everything. Elijah smiled, his expression warm. You don't owe me thanks, Jake. You've done the hard work yourself. As they sat together, the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting the park in a soft, golden glow. For the first time in a long while, Jake felt at peace, not because his journey was over, but because he finally believed it was worth continuing. And as he watched the leaves fall around him, he knew he was ready to face whatever came next.